Thank you. I have lots of stories about I think there's more, the older you get, there's more going on. So it takes a while.
Yeah.
If you're younger, your vocabulary is like this.
Yeah.
Because you don't have a large one. But the older you get, there are many more words that can mean the same, sort of the same thing, like irk and peeve and anger and pissed off.
Yeah, and then you start looking for them.
Yeah, you go looking for all of those and trying to select the right one. There's a little bit of a lag time.
Yeah.
Whereas I think younger persons have more accurate memories, but older you get, the more complex your memories become, and a little slower. And then, of course, then there is senescence. That's when there's a
no memory at all.
Overripe, a little overripe.
Yeah. I feel that way a lot of the time.
So, are we recording yet, Douglas? Are we ready? Oh, we are recording.
Oh, we're always
press the button. That's a fitting subject there: memory and loss of memory, or absence, or the gap in between, based on, I don't know what you want to call it, the collection of knowledge that you've gained throughout your life, and trying to retrieve that knowledge. I think it's very fitting to this conversation, which I don't know how deep we'll go into this whole territory. It's something quite vast, I've realized. I think the two of you have read a bit of Barfield and some of Gary Lachman's books, and that recording that was posted. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, John brought his mobile library with him.
These are the ones that I've read. And the one that we got assigned today is in my computer. It's on my Kindle, but I went through it in the day. Yeah, so the literature is vast that he's drawing upon. And I look forward to everything he writes, but I also feel a little bit of disappointment because I'm just not going to get around to getting to all of these books. I mean, the literature he's drawing from is just vast. And no one single person, except for Gary Lachman, has been able to pull it off. But I think that's why these groups are so creative, because it gives us a chance. I may not have read it, but you may have read it, or we may have an author in common, even though we may not be referring to the same book. So I think that is a great help for our collective memories to function better, and maybe create some new knowledge as well. So thank you, Doug, for bringing this all together and making it possible.
Right. I think it was somewhat intentional, just based on how it related to our previous conversation. We throw out many names at any given time in our conversation, but Owen Barfield came up a few times, and just happened to watch the recording of Gary Lachman and Jeffrey Mishlove on the Thinking Aloud series, a great series that's kind of opened me up to a lot of pathways of books that I'll never get around to, but they do a great job of kind of honing in on the core of not just the book, but of the subject matter, kind of allowing you to get a feel for what's out there. And so this talk was based on the lost knowledge of the imagination. And sorry, I'm coming out of a sickness, so if you're having trouble understanding me, let me know. I'll try to speak up a little bit. But after I watched that, I observed some of what Lachman has written, and got into the secret teachers of the Western world, which seems to be a good introduction, and perhaps what led to his writing of John's holding up the book, so out of his many stacks there. And it's engrossing. Like you're saying, he covers, well, essentially all of known written history of these secret teachers, from considering Plato, Plotinus, Pythagoras, and all the way up to present day with Gebser and others that are kind of carrying on or grasping into the secret knowledge. I think Henry Corbin was the name that I'm learning about, that seems to be an in-depth scholar of the Arabic tradition, perhaps. But before we go too far afield, I'll try to frame at least what I've gathered, and then the two of you who have actually picked up the books and read the various strands that may take you off into infinity or eternity. I think it's good to define what is meant by the imagination or the imaginal realm. So the little blurb that was written, it compares the modern day view of imagination, which is more of the what you see in movies, or people with creative imaginations can create these great stories or make fantasy novels and various creative productions like that. And there's also the more perhaps materialistic aspect of the imagination that leads to creative innovation we see for the material world, such as jettisoning off into space, landing on the moon, or even the technology we're using right now is not something that could have been imagined perhaps 1,000 years ago, or actually made physical in the material realm. But that's not what is being discussed here with the imaginative realm or the imaginal world. I'll read a couple quotes from the secret teachers of the Western world. So he's defining the imaginal based on, it is, as Corbin writes, ontologically as real as the world of the senses, in that of the intellect. It partakes of and informs both in the sense that in it the pure abstract ideas are clothed in symbols, and the brute objects of the physical world can become imbued with symbolic significance. We enter it every night when we dream, and some intrepid explorers have entered it while fully conscious. And a few pages later, he defines, goes more into the imaginato vera, or the true imagination. So it has a cognitive noetic value. It is an organ of knowledge. So we learn from it and can come away from our inner voyaging with some practical, effective understanding, and not merely the pleasure of having been on a trip. As the poet and Blake scholar Kathleen Raine says, there is a learning of the imagination, and like anything worth knowing, its lessons demand hard work and concentration. True imagination is not sheer whimsy or arbitrary novelty. It works within a canon of symbols, images, and metaphors, a tradition that is manifest in its expression. While our modern positive notion of imagination looks to it for the new and original, which often amounts to the subjective and shocking, the imaginal tradition finds the original in what is close to the origin, to the primal, the archetypal, and which appears in different but resonant symbols in the different esoteric teachings. So it's, although we can all access this knowledge, the word esoteric essentially mean, I don't know the roots, but it's this secret teaching. It's this knowledge that's perhaps lost or hidden. And there's certain individuals in the past or individuals in our present that are attempting to bring forth this secret knowledge. So yeah, it's a creative agent, a pathway to knowledge. So when they're talking about the lost knowledge, they're mentioning that, and perhaps one of the two of you could explain a little bit more of like Barfield comparing the ancient language with present day language. But so the ancient texts, we can examine them. So that's one thing Lachman kind of taps into, is that though we can't actually know what the person 2,000, 3,000 years ago was thinking directly, we can examine these writings, and through the language, through the specific words used, we can kind of gain, or it reveals this evolution of consciousness. It reveals kind of the inner living history of those that were writing at this time. So these secret teachers or poets are often written about. So Blake, Coleridge, Goethe was mentioned in the video, and there's this kind of original participation, that this primal unity of mind and nature. And at some point, we've kind of jumped out of that as we've become more explicit in defining what's in the world around us. And I think something else that Barfield talked about that I picked up on was this original consciousness, which was before this kind of jump into the current consciousness we're in, maybe the mental rational. And then there's what he noticed and others have noticed is this active consciousness, this participation in making like a conscious participation in the cosmos. I think I'll stop there. I'm starting to jumble over my thoughts here, but I'm wondering, like, it's been noted by many that we're in this sort of revival phase, where we're on the cusp of quite a bit of change, as we see in the complexity of the world around us. And there are a lot of individuals that are perhaps tapping into this tacit knowledge, but as Kathleen Raine and the others sense and know that there's something about the secret side of this, not that it's, even though it's present all around us, and others can claim to have gained this knowledge, there's still got to be a balance of some sort. And so what is worthy and sacred is a question that I'm holding. What is needed? Oftentimes we feel there's this need to save the world in a certain sense, or awaken all the others, but at the same time there's this need to stick to awakening ourselves. So must it remain a secret? It seems at some point that it, even though it's always available, and perhaps in our age it's more widely available, widely known, these secrets to a certain extent. Just some of the questions I have. I'll allow the two of you here to pick up on some of these strands, perhaps.
You want to go, John? What I really appreciate what Lachman is doing, because he's simply exploring and presenting things that have been there. You know, I really, on the one hand, to me, there's a certain amount of irony in the fact that we call this lost knowledge or secret knowledge or hidden knowledge or whatever. It's been there. And since the Neoplatonists, at any rate, back in the, about the time the mental rational consciousness in Gapes' term was coming about, all of this stuff was published. It's available. It's, like anybody could read it if they wanted to. And I prefer to call it ignored than hidden or secret or whatnot. It's just like, well, we just don't want to deal with that, or we don't want to go there, or we don't want to have to, as the Germans would say, engage it in some kind of way. So it's there, but most people just don't know what to do with it because it doesn't really fit into how we generally see the world these days. We tend to look at things quantitatively or in a scientific way or even in a technological manner. And a lot of this, we'll call it knowledge for lack of a better word right now, but a lot of this knowledge is simply expressed in terms that most people can't come to terms with these days. So it's always been there. It's never been really hidden, but it was suppressed for a long time. We do have to remember that. I mean, we'll pick up on Copernicus and we'll pick up on Galileo, and the sun is at the center of the universe and everything, or the solar system and the planets revolve around it. That was simply suppressed for the longest period of time. It wasn't like it wasn't known. The Egyptians knew the world was round, even though in the Middle Ages everybody claimed it was flat. But it was known. It wasn't hidden. Nobody said you can't know this. There were things at a time, when we think about the mystery schools, that were restricted generally, let's say, from the general populace. And I don't think all of the things that were being passed along at that time, that might not have seen the light of day up until now. But I do believe that on the one hand, enough of that has been revealed that we can kind of fill in the gaps for the things that we don't know. And on the other hand, if you're willing to take alternative ways of knowing about things, you can find out anyhow. John points this out a lot when he tells us a lot of his dreams that he relates to us just reveals things that are, I don't mean to demean it, but they're just like patently obvious for anybody who's willing to look at them. But most people, when they see that it isn't patently obvious that actually means anything, because we're not brought up to see things in that kind of way. And so what Lachman does, and I greatly appreciate this to repeat, is that he puts this into really everyday jargonless language that anyone could understand if they wanted to, and allows anyone who wants to know about things that they didn't think they wanted to know about at one time. And I think that's the real contribution that he's making, because he's not from academia, and he's not from that scholarly, I have to prove a point. He has the luxury of being able to say, well, this is what's there, take a look at it. And we can look at it. And once you do look at it, and once you realize there's probably more here than meets the eye, it's something that one can get drawn into very quickly. And he leads us to others who, like Barfield and Steiner, he's familiar with Gapes. None of these people are foreign to what he's dealing with or what he's thinking about, and so he's able to show how they actually relate to one another in meaningful ways as well. I think it's a real big help, what he's doing.
Yeah, I think so too. Where do you want to start? I mean, this is such a sprawling, trans-contextual jungle with lots of interesting, it could be fruit, it may be edible, it could be poisonous, you don't know. There are lots of flowers, and there are lots of serpents underneath those flowers. So it's quite impressive, the ones that I read. And then there's Owen Barfield has been mentioned. I just finished this one. I'm looking at this one by Raine. He quotes Raine a lot. Here's one on William Blake. I think our friend Jeffrey is wanting to do a study of William Blake.
What was the Barfield book that you just finished? I didn't see the title.
This is actually a biography.
Oh, biography. Okay.
By this guy Simon Blaxland Delange, and he looks at Barfield and the relationship with Steiner. And Lachman wrote on Steiner, and there's this one I haven't read yet, Rudolf Steiner, his book on Goethe, which I think might be of real interest to us who are wanting to go into that direction. He also, these are just Beaufort, Henri Beaufort. This is a book, The Wholeness of Nature. It's drawing upon Steiner and Goethe, once again. I've read this book and another book by Beaufort. All of these books I got from reading Lachman. And I have a whole lot more that, and I'm glad to sort of, because I read this particular book about a year ago, I think when it first came out. Corbin I have too. I have half dozen books on Corbin, and I've read a couple by Corbin, Henri Corbin. But yeah, I just made a list. Corbin, Barfield, Henri Bortoft, Kesserer. Is that how you pronounce them? Kesserer? Gebser, Goethe, Steiner, Kathleen Raine, Antoine Favre. I did read two of his actually. Jung, Carl Jung, of course, Arthur Koestler, McGilchrist. These are just a handful of the ones that popped out that I'm familiar with, and there's a whole lot more that I'm not familiar with. But I think, and he also wrote a book on Swedenborg, which is very interesting, which I did read. Anyway, I'm just like letting you guys know that this is not none of this comes with a great deal of organization. You know? It seems to be much more like you make a permeable boundary, but that boundary doesn't last very long. And I think this is the nature of Romanticism, which comes after the Enlightenment. Because the Romantics, especially the Germans, and Goethe and Beethoven and William Blake and Coleridge, they did create structures, and some of them originated in traditional ways of thinking and writing, but they tended to blow them up. And I think there was an anarchic streak in the Romantics. And I think we're still in the Romantic age. It's not like it went away. I think back in this, we see fluctuations back and forth from seeking control and order, and then seeking spontaneity and creativity. And, you know, this fluctuates back and forth, you know, within like a period, and also within each individual, within a certain time and place. These tensions, you know, Nietzsche called it the Apollonian, or what was the other one? Dionysian tendencies. He tracked it that way. So, you know, I think 60s is very famous for being a period of anarchy and rebellion, and lots of people, especially young people, willing to upset the apple cart. And also a lot of music which you know, we sing along with that music still. And I think there was a backlash. I remember it very well back in the 80s and the 90s, where you had Reaganomics and Thatcher, and a wave of conservatism, which really, and we're reaping the benefits. They laid down I think the foundations for the oppressive agenda that's now I call neoliberalism, which has sort of masked itself as a, you know, as something that's good for everybody. But now we're beginning to see it's not good for everybody. It's good for fewer and fewer people are benefiting from it. And many, many more people are having to clean up after the party that they weren't invited to. Having been a servant to the 1%, I can tell you what that's like. Anyway, I'm just sharing all this because I think we're in the midst of a lot of, you know, when we see, you know, I think our politics is really fragmenting right now. And I think Lachman really tracks this well in this dark star rising, magic and power in the age of Trump. He really does, he's looking at the relationship between Bannon and the Russian oligarchs and the underworld of the 1%, who own large tracts of Manhattan, by the way, and have a lot to do with why the rents are so high. But at any rate, because all of these, the 1%, of course, have broken out of the economy that almost everybody else is required to function within. And that's what this, the race for the ultimate algorithm has really, that's being exposed. And with all this derivatives and that is way over my head, but I know a little bit about, enough about it because I live in a city where it's all happening right now. A few blocks away from me is where the center of all of that is. At any rate, I'm just sharing all of this because I think we're in this, the imagination is going to be crucial for all of us to make sense, and continues to make sense, much less to make meaning of a world that is in, our social worlds, which are in so much flux. Most of that is due, no doubt, to the rapid increase of our technology and our use of computers. But I'm just going to quote him a little bit. Imagination is not about make-believe, but about make-real. In other words, fake it till you make it. It's using that as-if frame. I'm going to act as if this were so, and, you know, observe what happens, rather than have a formal definition or a set of, or axioms that I'm or any kind of proof. He goes into synchronicities, which we've explored quite a bit here. We've talked about synchronicities a lot. He says, explaining synchronicities is not the point. I mentioned these as an example of our inner world, how our inner world can affect the outer one. In some way, we cannot as yet understand, our inner world reaches out into the outer one and arranges it so that a synchronicity will happen. And if you've ever had a synchronistic event, you know how I could not have planned this. But it is a causal connecting principle, as Jung said, or maybe it's like a causeless cause. So the world that we are living in at present, I'm going on to quote him, is in a state of flux, with old boundaries breaking down without new contours being established. There is a sense that anything can happen. Such times are, I believe, especially sensitive to the forces in play, and a slight shift in some element may have an effect much wider and more influential than one would have expected. It is at such times that something like Barfield's responsibility is especially needed. This requires a calm, detached, but engaged awareness, the kind of passive potency Swedenborg spoke of, an alert, self-possessed attention to detail and readiness to receive, with both ways of knowing available for work. In other words, we don't want to get rid of the left brain or the analytical side of our nature. We need that too. So with both ways of knowing available for us, it is in such a state of wakefulness and purpose that we have learned of the lost knowledge of the imagination. can be of use to ourselves and to the world. To paraphrase Blake, in the future, the world's face, as it unfolds, will depend on the minds that behold it. So anyway, that was the notes that I took, and I hope that's somehow useful to this conversation. And on a personal note, I remember when I was about, maybe I was 16, 17, I just created a peer group. A peer group had arrived in my life at a very crucial time when I was quite confused about almost everything. But one of my friends, Debbie, she was going to the Jung Center, which was not too far actually from where I lived. And I remember sitting in a circle of adults. It was sort of like group therapy. And Debbie, my friend, was going to therapy at the Jung Center. And I just was stunned because these adults, they went around the circle and they had to identify a symbol for the self. And so there was one person said, oh, my symbol is a tree. My symbol for the self is a car. My symbol for the self is a book. And then when it came my turn to speak, I was just so flabbergasted. I couldn't say anything at all. I was totally speechless. And I think and later, the lady who was running this adult, there was a support group. She was a therapist there, and she had worked with Jung. And she was very, very sweet and gentle to me, and she gave me a few exercises. And the thing is, what dumbfounded me, what made me actually speechless, was not that people were coming up with these symbols for the self, but the adults were actually sitting together in a room and declaring this out loud. I had never seen adults do anything like this before. And it was also, I realized, actually, it's the way that at that metaphor, it just as, because I don't know anything at all. That's my, and I don't think, and Oscar Wilde said, you should never interfere with natural ignorance. So I use that as if frame all the time. And it's interesting how the results that one can get when you use it in a responsible fashion. And I think Owen Barfield and Lachman was imagining, because it's not just that I report my dreamscapes is because I think that polyphasic upper roof chatter, the beta, that's about it. And I think that is, of course people kick back when they come back from work or the lab experiments, and they wiggle their hips when they listen to music, or they, go out and garden or whatever, play golf on the weekend. I mean, they get into different kinds of rhythms, and everyone dreams at night, and they have fantasies, and they watch movies, but these are not as important as the kind of that monophasic rhythm that comes from the rational, but it's increasingly the deficient rational, where that's the only, scientifically stamped, objective, that's knowledge. Everything else is just ornamental and fringe. Anyway, I'm just sort of wanting to stabilize. I think these are all of the thinkers that he's looking at in the occult traditions were attempting to stabilize transphysical senses. And I believe this is what a lot of the impulse behind lucid dreaming and working with dreams and what Jung was doing with the imagination, and certainly what Corbin was doing as he was tracking a lot of the Sufi masters. They were working with imagination. I think this is where they weren't, this was not fantasy. These are not fantasy-prone persons. These are people who are working with realities and beyond the physical five. It includes the physical five. It goes beyond them. And I think these are certainly capacities that we all have, but it isn't so much that they're just ignored. I do believe there is a taboo. And I believe thou shalt not know this. You will do what the boss tells you to do, and you will collect your paycheck. If you do, if you don't, you're not going to get tenure, and you're not going to get a job, and you're going to be in deep shit. Unless you have a trust fund and you can indulge these infantile return to the oceanic bliss of the womb, as Freud used to say. So anyway, I'm just sharing this because I think we're in the midst of this perhaps unprecedented friction between these different kinds of discourse. And I'm also just going to quote one other researcher. It wasn't mentioned by this author, but he said something interesting to me about written language and speech and the oral traditions. And we've been tossing around this for a while now. I think on our last call, we poked around with this. Speech is biological. It's a trait of species. It's genetic and universal. Writing is a cultural innovation, a technology. It's about 1,000 years old. Writing, we can talk to people who are beyond the reach of our voice and who are unable to see our signing hands. Our hands are signing. These are all signs. And then he goes on to talk about musical notation, which is the recording of musical thought, not sentences. And then he talks about mathematical notation, which is doing something else entirely. So I think all of these different codes, like writing is different from speech, and certainly musical notation is different from writing, and mathematical notation is another difference. So I think we're in the midst of how do we manage to create codes, crack the code while catching the rhythm, as Nora Bateson says. And I believe a lot of the impulse, I think, to socialize, to go out and have a beer or play pool or to, listen to music with your friends or to go to a concert or to play. It's about catching the rhythm and enjoying the aesthetics of catching other people's rhythms and of other people catching your rhythm. And these are the tempo rhythms, of course, are extremely hard to, when you pay attention to those kinds of, it vanishes very rapidly because there's something so sacred about rhythm. I think this is what Bateson said, how it's easy to go into a system and organize around pathologies because it's easy to figure out when something's broken. It's very hard to describe something that's working well. And most of nature is doing pretty good. It's doing just fine. And that's, I think, where he says we enter into where angels dare to tread, because that's very sacred. That's very sacred territory. So anyway, those are my sort of gut level responses. Sorry, it's not organized a little bit better, but I keep trying. Thanks.
Well, you started off with naming the various sources or resources that Lachman has kind of tagged you into. So I see your your speech that you just gave there, as the same idea or same process of, well, we started from one thing and well, we have this whole cosmos to tap into. And I don't even want to go into the bullet points that are going on in my head. As I mentioned last time, there's so much that I could try to say, but to tap into that space, these rhythms, as you're saying, it's increasingly difficult. Not only, as you started off saying, with age, with I've got so much to tap into and I can't even grasp onto one single word because there's so much going on in my life. And that speaks of our age, and we could equate the cycle or the code to, well, yeah, this original consciousness, and the act of consciousness is this child come into an adult or something like that, or whatever you want to throw in. And but here we are now. We are all conscious of what we're doing to a certain extent, or at least the speech that I'm, well, now that I think about it, I'm not fully conscious of what I'm saying, but and that's part of the point of the Imaginal, I believe, is there's so much going on, and so much we could say, so much we could do, and we can learn. We can learn to access whatever that means. This realm, this imaginal realm, which Lachman notes that these secret teachers have kind of tapped into as, well, you can call it God, or call it that one thing, the ideas, whatever the forms, whatever it might be, and there's this triune aspect of it, of the unconscious, conscious, as well as the interweaving of those two, that is needed. And one thing, at least I've learned when I've been in conversation on these cafes and on the site, is to not fully neglect one side for the other. So something that John and I worked on at one point was that I'm more of the ontological, I'll rocket myself out of my body type of guy to locate that God figure, that Godhead, or that imaginal realm. But Johnny focuses more on the tangible epistemological elements that can be grasped from dreaming or active imagination, or the process of interacting with others. And we kind of met halfway. We didn't actually write papers about it or speak directly about it all that much, but I think in our time here, we've come together and those two halves have been grafted together, and we realize that one is not necessarily the master of the other. But going back to this lost aspect of it, and Ed touched on it, there's just sort of, it's not secret, as you said, it's an ignored aspect. But we do, Lachman, as we're stating, does throw it out straightforward. And that's what I appreciate. I read 300 pages within 2 days. I haven't done that in a long while. Even though there's so much information, I'm reading from the history of the Western world of the secret teachers. But I don't have to memorize everything that he's writing. I just know that I've taken something from it, and the way he places it on in this language. Yeah, anyone, if I can understand it, then anyone can understand it. So, but the knowledge is out there, as you're saying, Ed, and it's able to be tapped into, but who's listening? Who's willing to listen? And I believe we are. I believe pretty much anybody on the site is willing to do that. And yeah, where do we go from there?
I'd like to come back to something that John had mentioned, because I think it's exceedingly important. And that's we have to act as if. This as ifness. That's probably the most ignored, neglected, hidden, secret, esoteric. You know, you can make a rabbit hole out of it, and you can go down it. Because we've all been raised to believe that as ifness is something dishonest. It's not just fiction. You know, this is, you know, people talk about fiction and then they say, yeah, but it's a lie. You know, that idea. That's kind of the coloring I want to give to this. But this as ifness is so essential to our individual well-being, I'm going to say, probably to our collective survival, that we probably should stop and think about it a little bit. When I left the Army and took on a teaching job here in Germany, at that time in Germany, it's still pretty much the case, but not as much so as then. When you took on a job, it was a job for life. The chances of you being fired from that job were slim to none if you didn't rape the boss's wife, steal the family heirlooms and the silverware or what. I mean, you really had to do drastic things to get kicked out of your job over here because culturally things didn't work that way. There was no hire and fire. There was none of this neoliberal, you know, the corporation is supreme and everyone else is simply a servant or a tool or whatever it is to that. Now, a lot of that's come in the meantime, so we're dealing with a different culture now. But back then, once you had a job, chances were good you were going to retire from that job. People didn't think about, who do I want to work for? The question most Germans that I knew ask is, which company do I want to retire from? Which was how it was actually formulated. So it was a whole different way. But after 8 years of that, we moved from that kind of thinking to Silicon Valley. And I am a non-engineer. I was an English teacher. I studied philology and psychology and literature at a German university. I have a certain understanding of math. I started out, I had a couple of semesters as a math major in my undergraduate world, which is why I taught math at the school as well. But so I understand a little bit about that. And my best friend at the school was the math teacher, so one of the math teachers, and you know, so we would talk about things mathematical, if you will, but that just wasn't my thing. I was more into this analogical, literary. Let's think about it, talk about it. Let's narratize it to whatever kind of that. That's how I kind of took on the reality. And I show up in Silicon Valley. I'm the only person that speaks English in my family. My wife was a nurse but can't work because she's not licensed to work there. So I find myself in one of the most literally brutal environments that you can think of work-wise. Hire and fire is the name of the game. You don't go somewhere and say, my first permanent job where I had a contract lasted 8 months and then I was laid off. I picked up a contracting job right on the end of that. I realized how things had to work and how to function. And this is where I come to this as if. We lived there for 15 years and I was the sole income or bringer for the family. We were a family of 5 people living in Silicon Valley on one income. We were an anomaly. When people found out that my wife didn't work, the first question was, how the hell do you do that? and now that I'm out of that and I'm here and I'm retired and I think back on that, the only way that you can do that, and the only way that I managed to do that, I don't think that I'm particularly special, that I have any special qualifications, or that I have something up on anything else, but I realized very early on, and one of the reasons I realized this very early on is I got affiliated with all of this esoteric kind of knowledge. Very early when we were there, I hooked up with the Rosicrucians, and they have a whole different way of looking at the world anyway. So, and it was which was for me interesting, because coming from like this adopted German background and studying at a German university, which saw the world exceedingly differently than anyone else. After my bachelor's degree, running into Gadamer and hermeneutics and understanding being the foundation of whatever it is that you're going to do in life, that was also a new world for me, kind of thing. But one of the things that they practiced and that they tried to get you to start practicing for yourself very early on was visualization. And visualization, if it's done properly, is nothing more than as-ifing. I always imagined myself employed. I always acted as if I were. And as it turned out, I always was. In 14 years, I did not have an income-producing position anywhere for a total of 2 months. And the only reason I didn't get any income for that is it was all based on what you produce at the end of the project that I was doing. And I left that project before I got paid for doing what I was doing, because I got another job doing something else. But it was this as-ifness, this believing that things are a particular way. Now, we can call that magical, and it does have a certain amount of magic coloration to it, because that's the entire, I think, focus and intent of magic. If you ever run into a real magician, and I have, these are people who take ritual baths and dress up in robes and go into a separate room and draw circles on the floor and perform ritualistic acts in order to effect changes in the world out there. And I know for a fact that they do. So I know that all of our scientific friends goes, well, no, that's just all coincidence and that kind of happens that way. Well, but no, you can influence this reality. But they are also doing a form or performing an aspect of this as-ifness, because they act as if they are changing the reality, and the reality does in fact change. And this is why I find it so enlivening on the one hand, but so captivating on the other, when people like Corbin talk about this imaginal, whatever it is, and tell you flat out, without any hesitation, there is a reality to this that should not be ignored. It is as real as this, the desk that I'm sitting at, the books that are on the bookshelves, either here or in John, or the well-defined sound-absorbing ceiling that's over Doug's head. It is a reality, and to dismiss it as being unreal or not, it's fictional. You're imagining that, you're just thinking it up. I know for a fact this isn't true. That's not how the cosmos works. It works differently. And if you, and I'll use a phrase that John said, if you can get into the rhythm of the cosmos, and if you can do this as ifness, if you can live that, it is absolutely mind-boggling what can come of it. I didn't come out of Silicon Valley like everybody else, rich and famous. I survived, but we all survived. 5 people survived. The family didn't destroy. We didn't implode. We came out of there healthy and happy. moved back to Germany for, a number of reasons and whatnot. But we also saw that the handwriting was on the wall because the insanity had taken over Silicon. When we left in 1997, that whole .com thing was literally blasting off the launching pad. And anybody that had half a sense could see this is going to end badly, and it's going to end badly soon, which it did. It only took about 3 years and you were gone. And me, without an engineering degree or anything that would actually qualify me in some way, shape, or form to be performing there, it seemed like a good time to leave. And so we did. And I imagined that I would come to Germany, we'd find a job, and things would go. And they happened that way. Now, you can call me the luckiest human being who's ever been born, but I don't believe that it was just luck. I also believe very firmly that we make a lot of our breaks simply because of how we think about what breaks might be possible for us. It's as ifness. And we need to foster that, and we need to, to kick that around with others, and we need to share experiences so that people who are maybe a little hesitant about, you don't have to dive in head first. I got thrown into the cold water. I didn't have much choice, but I don't think that's necessarily the way that everybody has to go about doing this. But that as ifness has a reality to it that is, I think, essential for all of us at this stage of the development or evolution of humanity, whichever word you choose to use to describe that, because we can see, this is the other side of the coin, we can see that what Gapser would call the rational structure of consciousness is literally in its death throes. Every day when I turn on the news, I'm going, it can't get any worse than this, and every day it gets worse. And you can see how all of these folks, from the bankers to the stockbrokers to the capital investors to the large corporations, are literally grasping at straws, or the 1% are grasping at straws, trying to hold on to something that has become completely ethereal. All of that wealth that they have is unreal. I mean, we say that, we go, oh, that's unreal how much wealth they have, but it has become unreal. And they are slowly, but rather quickly, coming to the realization that this is, the Germans would call it an air castle, a Luftschloss. yeah. I haven't even read it, and I'm going, from what you said, I'm going, oh, okay, that kind of sounds like what I'm picking up on as well. And that's, once again, that's one of the things that I think Lachman is really good at, is tapping into this. And this is also, the thoughts are there. The noosphere, you can call it whatever you want, the noosphere or whatever, but thoughts are things and they're all out there. And we just tap into that. We're like, that was another metaphor that the Rosicrucians like to use, was we're like radio receivers. And when you tune into the right channel, you get it. And you get whatever the channel is sending. And you don't really have to do any more than just tune in, but you have to tune in. And part of that tuning in is acting as if you were a radio receiver and saying, I'll let myself tune into this. And the next thing you know, you got stuff coming in and goes, maybe I better change the channel for a while, because it gets a little overwhelming as well. And for me, I think the biggest realization in all of that was how easy it is on the one hand, but how demanding it is on the other, because it's so easy. So you really have to learn how to deal with it and use it. There is as John had pointed out before, we can't do away with control, but we certainly have to learn how to control in a way that's beneficial. And that's something we're really bad at, really bad, as far as I'm concerned. And so when we learn to do those kinds of things, it's amazing what does happen. And I think that when enough people start doing this, not necessarily critical mass, but when enough people start doing this, things out there in that reality that we share starts changing. And we need to keep that in mind, that it's changeable and it will be changed. And we can either participate in that change or we can let the change happen to us. That's also a possibility. And I'm not sure that that's the one I would like to have. I'd rather be participating in the change if I can.
Oh, Johnny, did you want to?
No, go for it, Doug. Go for it. Did you have something?
Very briefly, and these are questions related to power or control, or which I don't expect you to have the answers, either one of you, but John held up the book Dark Star Rising, another Lachman book, and that speaks of our current age that Ed was just talking about, the bankers and the constant bombardment of insanity in the news, perhaps. Yeah, maybe insanity is a good word for the whole aspect of it. And maybe I will share a few stories, a few experiences of this as ifness. So when I'm at my best in this as ifness, and a little background about myself is that I don't take well to teachers. Everything's been a learning of my own, and I don't come from any tradition, though at times I wish I had the background of tradition. Ritual, I think, is the sacredness. It's been there personally that I want to hold my life and the world around me sacred, but it can't always present itself in the world as the world is presented to me. But when I'm acting as if, when I'm in these realms, you do gain a certain power. And I don't know how deep I want to go into that word, but for me, it comes with communication with nature. I'm the nature boy, perhaps. I can talk with birds. The other example that I find comical at times is that insects will speak to me. They'll land on certain words on a book when I'm reading, and it'll be an inside joke to some depth of knowledge and of that particular word for me, or it'll be my highlighter for a phrase, or I'll be in a conversation with somebody and the specific spot that it lands on. And sometimes I wonder if it's really there. Just last week I was reading, I think it was this weekend, I was reading and something landed right on in between my nose to where I crossed my eyes, which was another comical thing. Like, oh, I can't read now because my eyes are crossed. And I went to look in the mirror. I felt the sensation still there and nothing was there. But I know something landed there, whatever it might have been. And but when I'm in the zone, when I'm tapped into this as ifness realm, there's so much reality that presents itself to me. And this isn't criticizing anything that you've experienced in your life, but it's something I personally, perhaps I'm a self-sabotager in the sense of career, anything related to the physical man-made world. So in my line of career, I say, well, I don't want a job. I don't want this. And well, I've gotten what I wanted a lot of the times. And I don't think I've told anybody here this, but in the past, every single job that I've had has either discontinued, been shut down, every single one of them, from fast food to the troubled youth camp that they stopped being funded. But something in my worldview changed that, like I didn't want this to happen anymore because it was kind of scary. Because I was tapping into a realm that I didn't imagine, or I didn't necessarily want to exist. It was affecting other people. This wasn't my power. This was some sort of higher power. So I've changed my worldview, and now there is no end in time. So it also reflects my philosophical view. It reflects my perspective in the earth. And so my participation on this site, for example, there's always the background knowledge, it's at any moment, like, it could collapse. We're not going to communicate on the threads. We're not going to, the cafe is going to end, or something like that. There's that brief thought now. But as I've learned more about cycles of tapping into maybe the ritual, of not holding on to one particular view, and yeah, it's a realm of learning. I've tuned in, and there's a certain aspect of control. For me to describe it beyond what I've already told you is beyond what I can do now. But I guess going back to what I was getting at is this dark side of the secret, and the dark side rising, the dark star rising, as he terms it. And I don't know what the book's about, and I hope maybe John can clarify it a little bit more. But so, and this isn't a question that needs to be answered here, but I'm asking, like, what, with my little insect power that I carry with me, or the comical side of things, like what participation can I have in the greater scheme of things? So it's great for me, my family, that we're secure. I feel more secure than I ever have before as I tap into these realms. But there's so much strangeness going on, so much strange power. Yeah, I don't want to even go beyond it at this point. I'll let you talk, John. But
Can I just say one thing, John, before you start? I just want to reinforce and maybe console Doug just a moment here. I know when you said every job I ever had doesn't exist anymore. I worked for 31 different companies in my life. And of those companies, about 5 of them still exist. The companies don't exist, not the jobs. The companies I worked for don't exist. And of those maybe 5 that are remained, the divisions or the sub-entity of that corporate entity or that organizational structure that I work for, they don't exist anymore. But the higher entity does. And for the longest time, I thought I was the angel of death. I did not want to work for certain companies because I didn't think it would be fitting for me to make them go away. so if it's just the jobs,
good. I'm not alone in that.
You're not. Yeah, that's the thing. You're not alone. and the thing about life is, we find this out always later. We're never alone. Never. There's always somebody else that had something similar, and it's beautiful when you cross paths with them and you realize, we're on that same, that same kind of vibrational path. I'll put it that way. That same kind of vibrational path. We're sharing there's a resonance between that and what we're doing. And I'm sure John's a person that also hasn't had one employer for his life.
I've considered myself self-employed my whole life, even when I was working.
Even when you're working for somebody, right?
Especially if I was working for somebody else, I was self-employed. I think it's so tricky. I think back in the 80s and the 90s, people were talking about you create your own reality. I always thought that was a little psychotic, because, well, yes and no. Yes, you do create your own reality, and yes, and also so does everyone else. And that means they're creating aspects of your reality, whether you want to or not, because you're not separate, atomistic little entities, skin encapsulated egos. I think as we've already Castaneda and Watts and a little bit of Wilbur, and certainly Gary Lachman, I think, draws on a lot of these authors. Authors of the Impossible, I think, is a book by, who's that author of religion that I love so much? She wrote The Flip. Yeah, Kripal. He just gives one example of another of authors who, writing about the impossible. I was reminded as you were talking, both of you, of it could go in a lot of different directions, but I was thinking of Inigo Swan. He was a psychic who worked for the CIA. And Lucy, who was in our other study group, in the Bateson study group, she told a story about him, and she also sent a manual from the remote viewing training manual that it was hilarious. It gives you all these little charts and everything, and the exercises that they follow to train people in this capacity. They all have to read Betty Edwards' Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain? She had a classic on drawing. That was required reading. Everyone had to read that book. And evidently, Inigo Swan was so adept at remote viewing. He went down, it was Lower Manhattan. I think there's like a Fort Knox down there. There's lots of gold underneath, somewhere underneath Wall Street. And he was being escorted by some CIA people who were thinking about hiring him. And they wanted to know if he could remote view a very secret setup for how this gold bullion in Lower Manhattan, where it was protected. He was able to do that. And the very skeptical CIA operatives here, he realized, because he was psychic enough, they had a choice. They could either hire him or kill him. And I thought this was an extremely amusing story. But as he reported, he said it's not like you're going out there somewhere, getting the info and coming back and recording it. It's much more like, and this sounds to me very quantum kind of thinking. It's much more like it's already there. It's not like I have to go somewhere to get it, travel 100 miles and remote view it and then come back. But also some of the reports from remote viewing is very amusing, because sometimes they go to the site and they report information that wasn't requested, but they may have gotten actual information about that site the way it looked 20 years ago, because they will go back and do a little research and they'll realize, oh, that was a description of a building that was there but has been torn down. So it seems like some of us can remote view past and future. It's very fluid and dynamic. And it's very tricky getting the information that's useful to the CIA. But there was a lot of trouble psychically when the CIA requested persons in this to actually do harm to other people. Now, some of those people may have deserved the harm that they were getting, like Saddam Hussein, but you never know how this can be used. And so I think these are the kind of questions we have to start asking ourselves very seriously about. This is why it's trivialized by so many. It's not because they don't believe in it, but because they're doing it and they're using it against you, my friend. And they're claiming they're rational and they're operating out of a rational worldview. But I believe, according to Gary Lachman, that they're actually operating out of a deficient magical worldview. And it's like, who, I can't remember his name is, but they're winning. They're winning. And it's deficient magic in relationship with deficient rational, I think, which is what this algorithmic frenzy is all about, certainly in Manhattan, which has dominated the culture here, and I think wiped out lots of what was interesting and rhythmic and had vitality about the city has been wiped out by this sort of corporate logo. But I'm just bringing all that up because as having been a member of a group, of a culture that was penalized and legally discriminated against, this is not, you do want to change the law, and you must change the law, because it actually anchors certain psychic states, certain capacities to diminish others. And I think these are thought forms. I've been visited by them on more than one occasion, and I can pick up on them. I can feel it before they've even, you know, I've been in groups in a conference room, and I can feel the presence of that dark force before they enter the building. And so I have this extrasensory perception when it comes to these kinds of deceivers. And I'm, you know, and it's not something that it's easy to put into words. It certainly is very nonverbal, 99.9% nonverbal. And I'm not saying I'm pitch perfect, but I've learned how to trust that. And that's why I'm here today. If I had not had more occasions where this worked effectively, I could not have survived, and I could not have supported the flourishing of others that I cared about. So it wasn't just, so it is a, I think we know intuitively, you know, our ancestors certainly did go left rather than right. And then they found out if they had turned right, they would have walked right into where the bear was, or the lion, or the predator was. So we come from ancestors who are right more often than not, or none of us would be here. So these, to just claim this is magical, and we've outgrown it, is really absurd. And I believe this is why we're so attracted to Gebser, because he was claiming there's a higher octave. The integral is the higher octave of the rational, the magical, the mythic, the archaic. And that from that higher octave, none of these previous structures have to be negated or denied. So we can cultivate the efficient forms of all of these previous structures, including the rational. So I think the rational, what I believe we're seeing is dying, is I think the deficient forms of the rational are on their way out, because the integral is already here. This is how some would phrase this. I don't know, that's an open question for me. But I think that the rational, we want the healthy rational, and we want to maintain the quality of our attention, so that we can cultivate these capacities. And they will come, and that's why I think the weird and the uncanny and the bizarre and the synchronistic, rather than sweeping all of that under the rug and pretending it didn't happen, I really invite people to cultivate that and really, pay exquisite attention to the insect that lands on the page of the book, or the song of that bird, because those are all signs. And the signs are there's no sign that is in control of the facts. There's only systems of signs and sign makers. And we are, of course, we do more than just signs, we do symbols as well. And that really can tie us into all kinds of weird knots. And I think that's where the paradoxes and the impasses and the dilemmas and the conflicts that we are in this deficient rational, we're struggling with. So more power to us. And I believe that, I think it would be a shame that we didn't get to this higher octave, because that's, I believe, where the great potentials that many have intuited could be unleashed. But it won't be without an equal amount of ethical development. We will need high levels of ethical development, that the other person is an aspect of my own nature, And if I can't get something, if I try to violate them in any way, I'm going to be violating myself. And I think healthy magic knows this. And there are all kinds of guidelines for magicians, the difference between, different kinds of magic. So that's my spiel. I find this a very interesting conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, see, I agree with you, John. One of the things I got, I and my wife and a couple of other people I know, we all got invited to a screening by Stanford Research Institute once. And they were looking for remote viewers for some government work. Yeah. This was one of the most fascinating afternoon evenings I'd ever spent anywhere, because they went through this whole spiel about how they, what they were doing. And one of the biggest funders of what they were doing, oddly enough, this was back, I'm going to say 1993, 94. One of the biggest funders was McDonald from McDonnell Douglas. He spent over, well, it was several hundreds of millions of dollars of his own private fortune he had invested in this kind of thing. And one of the things that they told us that evening, one of the problems that they were having is what you described. They would send people out to remote view, and they'd come back with stuff that was like 50 years old. That it wouldn't happen anymore because and so the interest in the research was declining, because for what you set up as a goal for the research, the results are unreliable. But they're exceedingly reliable because they're telling you you can't do that with this. And they hadn't grasped yet that you can't necessarily use these capabilities, which I also believe are inherent. I mean, we all have them to a certain degree. There are some people have them to a highly, like Indigo Swan has them developed to a high degree. I have them in a very, very rudimentary kind of sense, but I always pay attention to them, because if that happens and if that comes and if the signal arises, I always pay attention, because I know it's infallible in that regard. So they were losing some of this interest because they can't control it. You can't tell them what to do with it. When you try to use this for nefarious purposes, it usually backfires. But the feeling that you get, you know when that nefariousness is about, because they don't know it. They're trying to control this stuff. They don't know what they're actually churning up behind themselves or beyond themselves that they're setting into motion.
And it usually is behind them.
Yes.
That's where you better be.
Yeah, and they don't see it come. They have no clue that it's there. They think they're doing all of this, and there's certain things we shouldn't be feeding, and that's one of them. But there's a lot of folks out of sheer ignorance and sheer not knowing, or what's even worse, this arrogance of thinking that I know when you don't know, that is really going to undo a lot, and it's going to undo them eventually, that it's going to bite the hand that's feeding them, sooner or later, they'll be the last ones to realize it. But it does make it difficult for everyone else who's trying to just get a decent handle on these kinds of things and come to terms with them in some kind of reasonable way. And I found my experience has been, you can make people aware of the fact that they have at least the rudiments or the potentialities for these kinds of things. But my experience has also been that people are very, very reluctant to acknowledge that and to develop that, because it's like everything else, and this is probably the biggest lesson that I learned in esotericism, period, was knowledge obligates. And once you know something, you're responsible. And boy, do we not like responsibility these days.
Yeah, and you can't go back again. You can't go home.
You can't undo it. No.
And I think that's what Faust is all about.
Yes.
And making bargains with the devil and all of that.
You cannot do it.
And I think that's all Goethe's myth making. I think he really did capture something quite mythic there.
He was tapping into a whole lot of things in a whole lot of ways that that's why I find him so fascinating. That and I'm sure it's not just because Steiner worked through his archives, and I actually think that Steiner tapped into a little more of that than just what one would come across by working with it. I think he had a very deep, probably, let's call it an as-if kind of relationship with Goethe as well. And I think he was manifesting. So, but he's one of those figures that it would probably be worthwhile at some point in the future to go down a little side path and maybe take a closer look at what he was doing or what he was up to, because he certainly did capture a lot. I mean, nobody in Germany these days knows much about his scientific side because he is such a cultural icon, and I can't think of any event that I've been at where somebody quotes somebody that he isn't quoted. He's like omnipresent. But
yeah, I know how the Germans love Goethe. The German, the Goethe House here in Manhattan. I had a friend who worked there up on Fifth Avenue, and I would go up there and use the library, and I would also go to some of the events. So you'd have these German scholars and writers and thinkers, and who some of them lived in New York and they worked in the diplomatic service or something, and they'd all be sitting around having champagne. And I don't speak German, but not everyone was speaking German all the time. But you got some real characters.
Yes.
Really, very high aristocratic German.
Yeah, you probably got to experience some of the real old school.
Yes, yes. We're talking about 30 years.
It was only after World War II that they like eliminated the aristocracy in Germany. Now there's still people running around with titles, and they still have some lands and whatnot. But it's not like in England where it actually means something.
Right.
You could be Freiherr from whatever it is, and you're just Hans to me. So.
Well, I actually had a friend of the family's actually, and she was German, and she and my parents were in Germany after the war. My father worked in the military, and they very much liked it there. But I remember she was a friend of the family, and I remember she gave me mounds of records, and they were all like Beethoven and Mozart and Bach and music that my family were not interested in. But somehow she knew that I would be interested. She gave me all this stuff, and I went to my room. I had a little, a portable little stereo, and I listened to hours and hours of Schubert and Schumann and Brahms, and I got really turned on by it. And I went to the library and I read everything I could. But I think these were the kinds of, unfortunately, and years later, Laurie, her name was Laurie, lovely lady. She came to see me in a play. I had known her in junior high school and in high school, but she came to see me in a play when I was in college. And a friend of mine who was there, he was a student of German. He spoke enough German that he had a conversation with her. And he was very embarrassed. And he told me later, he said she came from a very old school, aristocratic German speaker, which really made him feel like a real goofball. I thought, well, that's sort of interesting, because I think that's what Laurie must have picked up on me as a young teenager, that I was a little different from everybody else. And she cultivated that. She came in, rescued me in a way from the ugly country western music, which I can't stand. Man, I love it now, but I didn't like it then.
You have to hate it first. You have to hate it first.
But I think all that classical music, that classical German music, just became my world for a while there, and it sort of saved me, because I could enter into these imaginal realms quite comfortably. And escape the brutal, violent circumstances that I was in. So I think but you have to have a sponsor. And
Yeah,
I was,
well, yeah, yeah.
and we've
And,
all had those persons
well,
who come in and see something in us and they sponsor that. And I hope we can do that as adults as well, because we still need sponsorship.
well, we
You
do. There's an old esoteric adage that when the student is ready, the master appears. And it's not necessarily that that's like the guru who's going to do it. Can be literally the homeless guy on the corner that you give something to, who says something to you. And at that moment, that's the, it can be the insect on your nose. It could be the homeless guy who simply makes a remark. But if we're not open to that, if we're not ready to hear or to receive what we're being told or given, or whatever that is communicated to us, we'll miss it, and it'll take us years to get back to that place. But we'll keep hearing it. That's the thing. The one thing that I used to kick myself, beat myself up a lot for missing those opportunities. But then you realize that if it's what you need, you're going to get it again and again until you get it. God is really the classical school master in that regard. You'll just keep doing it again until you get it right. But so it keeps coming back. But it's very helpful when we can get it early, because there's other things that are coming down the line, and they start piling up after a while, I find. So you kind of like to work them off as quickly as you can so that you're not overburdened at any particular time.
And that's what I love about coming of age stories. And you see this in Dickens, like in Great Expectations, and more recently that movie Moonlight, which was a beautiful film about a young black boy grows up. You see his evolution as and he's gay, and how he's mistreated and bullied, and his mother's a crack addict, but he finds a man in his neighborhood who befriends him, an older man, who ironically is also a drug dealer, but he's also a good father figure for this, pretty much a boy who's lost. And there's a beautiful moment where he takes the boy and teaches him how to swim. I think I posted it because it's such a gorgeous example of sponsorship, how a man embodies this for this younger boy. And you see that that someone paid attention to him, gave him that quality of attention, transforms his life. The worst kind of environment. But he finds a few people who sponsor something. And he is, I think, at the end of the movie, transformed. And we as the audience members are transformed as well. I mean, that's the good news. We see, because we all have had those experiences, no matter how bleak and miserable circumstances are. Sometimes there is the kindness of a stranger that comes out of nowhere and gives you the advice or the help or the assistance or whatever it is, or that gives you good directions or the pat on the back. You never know. But the kindness of strangers is very palpable and very real. And you may never see that person again, but you look back on it and you realize, oh, that was one of those angels, you see in those corny Hallmark Hall of Fame movies. But I know it's corny, but it's true. There are these angelic beings that come out of nowhere and just rescue you in ways that otherwise you'd all be pretty much doomed.
Anyway. One of the interesting things is, John, about those angelic figures. The Hebrew word for angel, what we call angel, is malach. And its root meaning is simply messenger. It's not this heavenly, otherly, transcendental being. It's just a messenger. And of course, God is the person sending the message, but when you encounter this being, then he gives you the message, whatever it might be. And then you can do with it whatever you want. Most of the time we fail to get it, ignore it, go, it can't be, whatever. And then realize later, oh, gee, maybe I should have listened to whatnot. But that's the thing that I find so so attractive about that particular way of describing it is that it's not an extra being. We all, and because if you take that in, if you incorporate it into yourself, then there are lots of times when you are giving a message to someone else, you don't know that you're the messenger.
That's right.
And they don't know that you're the messenger, and the message comes across, but at any one point in time, it could be that way. And this is why I like to describe it as open. We have to be open to the fact. You know, I've heard another, I think it was a Sufi one that said it, every person that you encounter has a gift for you. They don't know they're carrying it, and you don't know what it is, but every person you encounter has a gift. And if you could only find out and get the gift that they have for you. And the other side of that coin is you are carrying around gifts for everybody else that you encounter, and you don't know what they are. You know, if we keep that in our consciousness when we're dealing with other people, it does help restructure our relationships a little bit so that we're not as kantish, as cornerish, as the Germans would say. We don't have as many corners on us when we're doing
that. Right.
Welcome back, Doug. Did you get lost or something?
I was still listening in, but work got the better of me. I had to respond to a couple emails. And I know Ed would say, well, if you're in the conversation, you disregard all those, but at the same time, I am supposed to be working right now. So I
you got to do what you got to do.
Exactly. Well, if I was physically there with you, I wouldn't be involved with work. So anyways, I really appreciate this image of the messenger, the angel, and that really speaks to how I perhaps want to exist in the world. I want to clear those boundaries as I'm doing the ancient way of delivering the message that takes hours and hours, days and days, just to simply take a mental note to the king or something like that, and you're trying to avoid snakes and obstacles. But as you're saying, if you clear away those obstacles, then we are better open to receive the gifts and deliver the gifts. And I've witnessed that within my own upbringing of my children, but at the same time, my family unit is only one small message I have to provide. And as Johnny said, well, he doesn't have any children, but he sees each of us as some sort of child. He's trying to.
Well, they're my children too.
Right.
When I see children, I don't feel like they don't belong to me. They belong to me. You know, I'm not responsible the way their parent is, but I create conditions for that child to flourish. Of course I do. And I have a responsibility to do that. And I think that's where all parents should feel that, but they don't often. They just think it's my kid. I don't give a shit about anyone else's kid. I think that's having tragic repercussions, that kind of ethnocentrism.
And so as I branch away from, it's not a singular focus. I'm not just saying my family will survive and yours are bound for hell or whatever. And but I'm learning to finally branch out and be that messenger. So I'm brave enough now to speak to my neighbor about the constant stream of Sprite and Coke that enters his 2-year-old's body. That, like, what the hell are you doing here, buddy? And that's one aspect of it. I could go to each house. Most of the people on my cul-de-sac have children, and I don't want to be quick to blame others or criticize others' parenting skills, but it's blatantly obvious how these kids are treated. And I've never shared a single word with one of the fathers. Just simply, I've tried waving, I've tried a hello as I'm passing by, and nothing. So there's this divide there, and he lets his child go biking in the middle of the road, and he literally almost gets hit every day. I think the neighborhood vehicles realize that this child is not supervised. So once they enter into that area where he usually is, they check in with him by slowing down even more than they would for somebody walking by. But I'll take my own son on a bike ride, and I don't know what's getting across to this child, but he's been going on bike rides with me as I take rides with my child, and it's a constant bombardment of questions from him, to the point that I'm a super patient person, and I'll answer each question as I'm trying to pay attention to where I'm going on my bike. But you can tell he's not receiving any message from his parents. He doesn't have it. Maybe school he is or something like that, but there's a little, I'm sure he's learning plenty from his parents, but I don't want to judge. But there's this gap, but there's something I can provide for him, rather than just saying, whatever, that's just some dumb kid, and going off and not responding. I've been answering questions. I've been seeing what I can do for him. But I don't, at the same time, I'm not some magical angel that's going to save his life. I think that's a certain type of Christian perspective on the angelic being, and if you listen to my wonderful kindness, then you will be saved. But that's not the type of being we need to be in the world. But there's this clearing away, as you're saying, of the path, and maybe he's still a child, so he's not going to magically receive the secret knowledge, the untappable knowledge, or I forget how you phrased it earlier. But there's that opportunity within each interaction, and yeah, it's a clearing away of the various veils or obstructions that really open up various realities, and as we're saying, the creation of new realities, the conscious participation in these realities. And I was wondering, when you were talking about the high German individuals, that they're not demanding that you call them by this title, but they're still holding on to these titles. And we talk about leadership in our day of age, and I think we're beyond the idea of leadership to a certain extent, to where we don't need any particular title. But at the same time, we're not, it can become a big mess if we're all just spouting off our own message. So we need that ritual to define our leadings, I guess. Yeah, I'm really appreciating this conversation.
It's, I think the fact that the boy found you, so he goes with, which is indicative in and of itself. And the thing I like about that, the Hebrew notion of angels, is that it's not Christian. It's no above the normal. It's always a human or human-like. You would never know when you ran into one that it wasn't just another person, another human being. Even if that messenger, and this is the story that comes across, when Abraham meets these three strangers who come to his tent, and he gets one of them, according to some readings of that story, is God himself. And that's the one who tells him he's going to have children. But there's nothing really in the story other than this interpolation and interpretation from the rabbis later on that is who that is. It's always somebody you would never know was God. You would never know. And that, I think, is the important thing, or at least for me, that's what I take from all that. Now, one of the things I find interesting about the word, it's just MLK, and it's got some vowels to go with it. So it's malach when it's a messenger. But if you say melech, it's the king. So the malach is always underway in the service of the melech. So it's the same word, basically. It's the same three consonants that express, I don't have to be the one and all. Yeah, well, in a sense you are. In the moment that you can provide any kind of guidance, directly, indirectly, intentionally, unintentionally, just by being there. You do have that, you take on that role immediately of that direction, that kingship. And it's not a sense of royalty that I am beyond you. That was a nice thing I liked about learning a little bit of Old English. When English first came to be considered a language about 500 AD, the king was addressed by the informal form, thou, which is the same as the German du. It's not this formal, it's not your honor, I can tell you. That's like 2 steps removed from it. This was just like I'm talking to my neighbor and go, get your shit out of my yard. That's the same way you talk to the king. You just talk on that level. It was directly eye to eye, face to face, person to person. There was no class distinction. You just happened to be the guy that the rest of us are allowing to sit there, so to speak, as the one in charge. And the people that can do that without letting other people feel that, those are the people that we call leaders. And because you're never going to train a leader, ever. I don't care how many graduate seminars you put up. I don't care how many degree programs you establish. You'll never, ever manage to do that, because it's not something that you can make someone become. You can't you can't train them to do. Who's going to do that? The people that think that they could do that are obviously not leaders. It's kind of a self-defeating thing. They emerge. We know who they are. And the nice thing about the way things are developing these days, I find, is that in any kind of group, be it, let's say our infinite conversations, at any one time, somebody steps up and says, well, okay, I'll do this. And they do it, and everybody goes along and helps out and whatever. And the next, and it might be 2 sessions into whatever you're doing, somebody else has picked up the ball and is running with it, and everybody else is working along with that, because it's not about the person who's doing anything. It's about whatever's being done. And so we depersonalize on that one side, and the people who are participating realize that where I'm called upon, I can and should, and where I'm not called upon, I don't have to, and I need not. And that is a kind of interaction that I think is very exemplary for anybody that's listening or watching to this, in environments that they're in. It's you can't. It's real hard for me to designate like the leader or the person in charge. It's just okay. Well, we'll go this way, and then we'll go that way. However, which way is necessary for whatever it is that we're doing. Because whoever's the leader has to be in tune with whatever else is going on in that configuration that they happen to be in.
Yeah, there's in tune, in alignment, or attuned to the needs of the group. And sometimes we're called upon to share an anecdote or story, something spontaneously for the group. It's not necessarily about my need to express myself, although it's related, certainly, but there's something for the group. And I believe that's a very necessary aspect of a healthy first-person account, is you bring that to a group. It nurtures the group, rather than being dominated by a third-person objective account, which I believe is deadly if it's the only form of discourse allowed. And I think that's the unhealthy, deficient, rational objective, which is creating so much havoc in our group life, and something I believe that we can get better at. I do believe that it's like a skill. You just practice, and I think that that's how you get to Carnegie Hall, and that's how you get better groups. And love, for me, is a skill. It's skill-based. And sometimes love isn't enough. You need more than just love. And you need a lot of luck. And I think there's relationship there. And sometimes we have been angels to other people. We didn't intend it to be that way, but we just had to do something, and we stepped up and we did something almost impossible that no one could have planned on, including yourself. I remember a neighbor of mine, she was middle-aged, late middle-aged. She had a career. She lived in a tenement building like I do. And below her, there was an Italian lady with her daughter, who was cognitively impaired in some way, her teenage daughter, young adolescent girl, maybe 12, 13. The mother died, and the girl was sent to some halfway house somewhere, some sort of foster home. But my friend, she said she'd look out her window and she'd see across the street this little girl who had escaped from the wherever she had been sent, and she'd be hanging outside the apartment. And she said she wasn't an attractive little girl. She was really chubby with thick bifocal glasses, and the kind of little girl that you love to beat up at the playground, that kind of girl. She would attract that kind of animosity. And she was also had some sort of cognitive impairment. So my friend adopted her and raised her as her own daughter and got her the special education needs that she had. And she grew up and became a functioning person, got married, had a happy life. And I asked my friend, I said, well, what possessed you to do that? That's a sort of big responsibility to adopt this child. Most people didn't want anything to do with it. And she said, well, I knew that if I didn't do that, nothing good would ever come my way. It wasn't a risk cost benefit analysis. You know? She said she knew it was her turn to give, and she did what she was supposed to do. It's the right thing to do. And I think people do know it's the right thing to do. It may not be convenient, it may not make a lot of bucks, but it's the right thing to do. And there are enough persons who feel that it's not because you're a virtuous person, you just know you have to do it. It's your turn to give, and you do that. We've all had those moments where we were compelled to do things that were not necessarily in our best interests. And thank God that we're able to register the effects of the field. There's something that wants to happen here, and it looks like I'm gonna be, and it's gonna come through me, whether I like it or not. And there are risks involved. There certainly are.
The Old Testament, John, describes that every time God comes out and says, listen, I want you to do this for me, the first thing that they do is beat feet. Yeah. Nothing good's going to come of this if you're coming around asking me for something to do. But it's like you say, there are others who go, okay, it's my turn. I got to fess up. We'll do this. And that's where good truly happens. Truly happens.
And sometimes it's very subtle. You know, your parents want you to get an MBA, and you want to study Latin and the cello. But you go ahead and do the MBA program, and then you graduate, and then the market crashes, and there are no jobs in that field. For 10 years, you don't have a job. So, and you're living in your parents' basement. So you might as well have studied the cello and the Latin instead of doing what, you know, the consensus reality required of you. And I think we all know that, and we learn those lessons, hopefully, early on, so that we get enough sponsorship when we need it, so that we can have a healthy direction. But then, you know, there comes inevitable, you know, circumstances arise where it's not obvious what's the best thing to do. And when you don't know what to do, what do you do? And that's where I think Gregory Bateson and Nora Bateson are offering some guidance. And that's where I think we're moving towards a second, what did we call it? A second order culture, moving from a first order to a second order culture. And what would the signs be of that happening? And I think we can find signs of it. We can certainly find signs of people who are still caught up in first order. I'm over here, you're over there, you got something I want, I'm gonna create circumstances so I can take it from you. I mean, and this is basically the hardwired in our this kind of corporate worldview that we all, many of us have had a lot of experience in. But I think that that's starting to break up, and I think a second order culture, and who knows, there may be a third order even emerging in some spaces that may be a requirement of some people. But I think those mentioning, Doug, you mentioned last time about I want an oral culture to develop. And you also mentioned that you don't want to write, but that you write. And that was, I think you mentioned that in one of the Bateson calls. And I thought that was an interesting dilemma that you were offering, because you had a desired outcome. I want to develop an oral culture, and I don't want to write, but I do write. And I think that, and I consider yourself a good writer. So I think that's some of the dilemmas that we have and the paradoxes that we have. And I think you also mentioned telepathy. And I think also Marco mentioned in one of our threads, he talked about maybe we should try the telepathic cafe. And I said, I think we're already doing that. There's a lot of our activity here, I believe, that isn't coming from the margins. We're triangulating from the margins, whether we want to or not, by the choices by how we frame things, by the choices that we make about what we want to study together, about how we organize our behavior in these forums, and what I will put aside my egoic sort of divisiveness if I think it's better for the group, if I go this way and that way. So what will I support, what I won't support, what will I agree, how do I disagree? Those are the kind of, I believe those are skills that we're learning how to develop that maybe we had acquired in our family of origin, our educations, the businesses we worked in, but most of that was face-to-face. And we were looking at the nonverbal because we were in the same room together and we were sharing the same environment in real time together. We're not doing that very much anymore, from what I observe. Most people are, have their laptop or their device, or their, much of their social life is conducted with people they've never met before, such as ourselves. I've never met either one of you in real time. I only know you through this mediation of this technology. So I think it's a different kind of skill set, and I'm still trying to get it. I think younger persons, it may come more naturally to them, but maybe not. It can also distort a lot of their relationships with the environment. That's been my observation, that I think that's a potential there. The flat screens can inhibit the affective zones as much as they make possible other kinds of learning opportunities. So it's a blessing, and it's also, I think, it can be misused very badly by nefarious forces. Anyway, so that's my spiel, and I guess we're getting ready to wrap up, but I find this has been a very creative exchange today, so thank you all very much.
Yeah, I agree with what we've produced here. In a way, ties in with everything we've talked about, and this is kind of a lost knowledge we've been talking about. And the cafe, these screen to screen talks are completely separate from each other, and I can only hope to have some sort of gathering or a ritual we form that involves the actual body presence. That would be great. But at the same time, we can tap into this lost dimension, or the lost knowledge, and there's much we've said in this talk, but much of it is this tacit knowledge, and we've gained through the three of us have been here, the two of you a little bit longer than I have, but this cafe setting has been a formation that has shed a few loose limbs that didn't need to be there, or loose ideas about what it should be. And I think this is a prime example of how it comes together, as have been quite a few of our conversations. And they don't necessarily go anywhere. We didn't magically, we're not going to come out of this, but writing a book or a novel. Maybe in the background we are, but I've been looking for a phrase, which I know I've said before, and I don't know if it's my own writing, or if somebody wrote it in their own poem, but and I've looked online and I just can't find it. So maybe it's my original phrase, but I don't necessarily need to claim it. But I'd say I am not a writer, and I am written, or we are not a writer, we are written. And yeah, this oral culture is what we're experiencing right here in my mind, is what this can be. But earlier, John, you brought up there's this speech, there's the written part, there's the various others fields or ways of bringing it all together, perhaps, or honing in that unspeakable dimension. So yeah, I guess that's all I want to say.
And just one other thing, I think what we talked about last time about completing distinctions and doing that intentionally. By what did you learn? What 3 things did you learn? Out of those 3 things, what was the most important that I share? And then find something that will amplify that, something that will ground that learning. And I thought that was something I felt created conditions for what you presented later in the week when you just had a 10-minute face-to-face, just you talking about what had happened this week in the forums, and just a quick summary. And I thought that was a very good example of what I imagine completing distinctions. What happens when we complete distinctions? And I believe that's good for, it was good for you, it was good for me. I responded to that. And I believe we can do that on purpose. And I believe that our groups, because there are many different groups getting started now, TJ and Ed and I and you, Doug, have visited too, this working with the axial age, which is a very ambitious project. And I think we're trying to organize our behavior around this. And I think that also others are doing, Blake, potentially, Savitri. There are other reading groups and study groups that want to happen. So I think it's just great that you sort of take the initiative of trying to report on the progress of all of that. Like once a week, 5 or 10 minutes, others could take turns doing that, fulfilling that function. So I think that is that to me is feedback, that this self-organizing system we're all members of, it can go to a second order. I believe by that kind of observing, participating, completing a distinction, so that it just doesn't go anywhere and maybe nowhere, that what you learn doesn't just evaporate overnight, but that we can actually create directions. And that's my feeling of moving out of the postmodern drift, which I find is epidemic in our society, especially with the use of technology, when people are not completing distinctions. And it's all being, vaporized, gets too ethereal too fast. And I think, I hope we can do more of this kind of completing distinctions and doing it on purpose. And I believe we can then, I think, practice more efficient liminal leadership, if you want to call it that. So thanks very much. This has been a great time. I've enjoyed it.
So have I. It's been a real nice couple of hours, especially since I haven't been around for a while. So this was a nice one to get back into it.
Doug, do you have any final statement? You ready?
I appreciate the feedback you just gave there. That's helpful. And I don't know. Just for the record, I don't know when I'm going to record these. Right now, I'm using the Cosmo Vision time because it's available, because it's on hiatus. But so yeah, if you shoot me an email, anybody, you two here or anybody else listening, just let me know if you'd like to participate in that. Like I said, it's just thrown together. I'm observing what threads are online, and since I just happen to be participating in most of the conversations, not that I have the knowledge, but like you're saying, there is some sort of bridge work that needs to be done, or blueprinting the various bridges. And it's helpful for connective tissue.
Yeah, as long as we're moving towards complexity rather than away from it. I don't want to over-complexify, but I think if we try to oversimplify, we run into just as much trouble. And that's where I believe I want to find that Goldilocks zone where it's just right. It's not too hard, but it's not too easy. And I think that's what happens when our cafes are at their best, is when we find that area. That's why I don't think we should lay on too thick, too many things you need to read, because we only have a few days to prepare for this. We want to read a lot of stuff. Let's do a study group. So I think that's a difference that we've learned through experience, how I think our best cafes, since they're a weekly event, has a different kind of rhythm from a long-term study group, which is a different kind of commitment, and has a different kind of challenge. So anyway, that's my spiel. And I think you're creating an oral culture. You're developing oral culture, which is what you wanted, Doug. That was your clearly stated desired outcome. And I think that's happening.
I've been performing a sex magic to make it happen. So I don't fully know exactly what is the intent behind all that. So maybe I said too much there. But no, I'm not drawing circles around myself to make this happen. But yeah, I think if you don't mind, continue on with the conversation. Yeah, we could have had a mess of a conversation if we tried to simply tie in some of the strands that Lachman introduced with Corbin, and we could have said, okay, well, let's talk about Gebser for 30 minutes, let's talk about this, but it's good for certain in-depth exploration. So the cafe is a good kind of central hub, and yeah, we can throw out whatever the hell we want to talk about and whatever reference we want to, but we don't necessarily have to. It's useful if you know, like the two of you here know the actual authors, have read the books. I've only recently just tapped into all this. And so we have this various fields. I think Michael said it at one point that he likes to perceive the other as someone, maybe it was an exercise he learned somewhere else. Everyone has so many different circles they're living within that when you look at someone, don't see their physical body and whatever's outside, just see them as so much, I can't remember the phrase he used, but yeah, entanglement or whatever term you want to insert there. And I think it's useful to realize that as we're talking.
That's right. That's right.
So, yeah, again, appreciate this conversation and this last segment of feedback. So I'll bring that forward.
One more thing, a metaphor I'm getting from Alexander Wendt, which I think is sort of what he calls it, open individualism. He says boundaries between individuals are blurred as the boundaries between oceans. And he's talking about interactions, that we form temporary unities of consciousness. And I think this is moving from a classical worldview to something that may be more quantum. But I find that very attractive. The idea is that the boundaries are blurred, just like the boundaries between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Oceans are blurred. They're different, but they're. I think that's just a very wonderful way of putting it. So it helps my thinking. Is when I'm with another person temporarily, we're creating a unity of consciousness because we are using language, and that means our minds are going to be entangled, whether we want to be or not. Our bodies might be over here and you're over there, but if we're playing with language, our minds are going to be entangled. And that, if we don't fight it, we can actually find different ways of working with it, rather than submission dominance, like we've learned in, school, we learned in our families. And I think that would be really fascinating if we could find those new ways of creating knowledge together, which I think we're doing. Thank you.
Appreciate it. That's a good one.
Have a good week.
Bye, everyone.
Well, give it a shot.